As you guys know, we are keen on amplifying candidates that are running grassroots campaigns against the establishment and giving them the attention that they deserve in the face of COVID. Because let me just remind you all, everyone who's running right now is running from home. They're not able to knock on doors. Most likely they don't have millions of dollars in the face of the establishment, which does have millions of dollars. The establishment can go out there and just buy campaign ads and send mailers to people's houses with literature, and they can spend all this money while grassroots candidates had depended on people power to challenge. Well, what happens when everybody's inside? Our next guest is Lindsay Boylan. Lindsay is running in New York City, which is the epicenter, of course, of this pandemic. She is running against a 30-year, almost 30-year incumbent, whose district comprises Western Manhattan into, Southern Manhattan and into Brooklyn a little bit. His name is Jerry Nadler. It's the 10th Congressional District. You may recall Jerry Nadler was one of those leaders during the impeachment hearing, complaining about Donald Trump, who is, of course, from New York itself. Lindsay, I've been watching your race super closely. Things got a little spicy this week. You've got a primary on June 23rd, and it looks like Jerry Nadler might be a little scared, and he was calling in some favors to,
Absolutely.
Push into your progressive Veritas. So how's it going?
It's good. Everyone says, how you doing in this environment trying to campaign? And I would say government and effective government and actually helping people matters more than ever. And it's very clear that our leaders aren't doing that. So I feel like I have a real mandate to be running, and every day is a new circus. But it's all worth it. I mean, there's nothing I would be more honored to do than help our community recover after this particular moment in time. And so, it's different every day, and I'm sitting here in, my house campaigning, but it's worth it. It's worth it.
New York has the highest income inequality in the country. And of course, things are likely to get worse after this crisis, this pandemic, in which so many wealthy have been able to afford to go to their second or third or how many homes they have.
Yes.
The wealth is extraordinary in New York and in Manhattan especially. And working people are forced in many cases to continue to work. They're on the front lines, working people of New York. And, several, when you look at where in New York COVID has hit the hardest, it is in working class neighborhoods. It's in immigrant neighborhoods who, many folks live, there's several of them that live in one home. And so you'll see a household. That's sort of how this strip kind of lines up. And it's extraordinary to me that you have New York City and the representation in your district in particular that just hasn't changed for so long, when this income inequality took place under their watch. And yet they can go out there and say, oh, I'm progressive. I'm a fighter for you. Well, if you look at your district, I mean, I know, I, as many people know, I ran for public advocate of New York, and your district has faced quite a shift in the last 30 years.
Yes.
How is it that this is just like people are brainwashed into thinking that the representation is there for them in New York?
I mean, let's just start by saying every 2 years, only about 30,000 people reelect this man, and he's never had a serious challenge. And
30,000 people in New York City. Let's just make that very clear.
Yeah.
That's like a building.
Yeah, exactly. And out of each congressional district, you're supposed to represent 750,000 people. And so we never have a fair accounting of what he's done, what he hasn't done, and what he should be doing. But I'll tell you what I know on the outset. This is tied for the most unequal district in the country. So we've got a fair number of the billionaires on that 100 New York billionaires list. And then before this pandemic, about 15% of our community was on SNAP benefits, and thousands of people living in substandard conditions in NYCHA. And
NYCHA's the public housing for New York.
Yeah, it's New York City public housing. Thank you. And you see that now in such a pronounced way, because I can't knock on doors. So I'm calling people in our community. And yesterday I was on the phone with a gentleman who lives down the street from me in Fulton Houses, and he didn't want to get off the phone because it was as if I was the first person who asked how he was doing. There has been no accountability in his building. He's talked about the transformation of his own neighborhood when he moved into that building decades ago. He could see the waterfront, and now everything around him is luxury properties, and all of the stores have changed. Everything is gentrified, and right now all of those luxury buildings stand empty. And you see that at night in this district. You'll see entire buildings that have all the lights off, and you see the disparity. And yet when I talk to people, if they're in the city, they're struggling. They haven't received unemployment benefits, or the unemployment benefits aren't sufficient, or they didn't get enough money, or they're worried about their neighbors, and a lot of seniors on fixed income. And it's just totally unacceptable that this is the reality that someone who is apparently so powerful has produced. It took him 30 years almost to pass 3 pieces of his own legislation into law. And only one of those is substantive. The rest, the other 2 are symbolic. One is naming a building after the guy who died in office so he could get the seat. And that's the kind of stuff these incumbents do, because there's no accountability. There's no accountability. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party of New York is at the heart of that lack of accountability.
So it's interesting. You're talking about these empty buildings. We've talked about this offline. When I ran for public advocate, it was really to be a check on real estate, the real estate developers who had been getting huge tax write-offs for decades. And it actually started under Trump. Trump got this sweetheart deal that was actually very controversial and illegal at the time. But he was able to get it because his father, Fred Trump, was such a big real estate developer and had influence and a large donor to the mayor and the governor of New York at the time, who were both Democrats. And there's this committee that was supposed to oversee, these types of deals, and it wasn't going to pass. And because of his father's donations, they pressured him, and they basically pressured all of the committee members, their positions, if it wasn't approved. And so that set the pattern of these real estate incentives, giving developers huge tax breaks to build these big buildings. But now there's this whole other element. You talk about income inequality, and I remember that, and the buildings being empty. I remember that New York Times article showing the empty buildings that were bought up.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are foreign oligarchs. And I ask you this question because they're using the real estate to store their cash because it's safer than banks in their countries who might seize their assets if they're, maybe shady dealings. And so this is happening in your district. I mean, it is the epicenter, at least in New York, your district and on the Upper East Side and maybe some downtown, for these types of deals. And yet you have Jerry Nadler, who is supposedly the Mr. Anti-Trump, who has never checked any of these deals. Trump's the architect of them.
Well, and he's actually, even going back to when he fought to be head of the judiciary, there were a few people who've been in the judiciary for a similar amount of time. And he made the case that he had beat Donald Trump, and he had really held real estate development interests accountable in New York. But you don't have to look very far across the west side of Manhattan to see how much of a failure that has been, to see it not only, I think most pointedly in terms of Hudson Yards. And I understand that some of these projects, these massive scale developments, are really in partnership with the city and the state. But you can't be a leader and really one of the most powerful people in the state and in the city and not use that to push back against this endless parade of constantly building and looking at the programs that incentivize just doing that, EB5 funding, all sorts of programs that are supposed to and incentivized to help economic development, but really it's just been a runaway train for real estate interests, especially in the city. And because, as we know, our state is largely and has been really, just controlled by a lot of real estate interests and real estate money, the congressman should have played a role in being above that and really pushing back for all of this time. The the kind of work we need, the kind of money we need for development is around affordable housing.
Right.
It's around supportive housing. It's around senior housing, because 1 in 5 people by 2030 is going to be a senior in this community. And that is a community that is on a real fixed income. And especially right in Congressman Nadler's neighborhood on the Upper West Side, that's a real challenge. And we haven't done anything to prepare for that. We haven't done anything to prepare for the future for public housing. We haven't done anything to prepare for supportive housing or workforce housing. Forget, we used to be a city and a state and a nation that actually thought about how we support working families. We just don't do that anymore. And if he's so powerful, if he has so much, juice in DC like he says he does, why hasn't he acted on any of these issues?
Right.
Is it because he's not as powerful, or is it because he just hasn't had to do anything about anything for a long period of time? And I think it's either one isn't an answer that's acceptable to keep your seat at this point.
Well, he's gotten away with it. Thank you for watching The Nomiki Show. You can support us on YouTube by clicking subscribe, like, and sharing to get those alerts. And patrons, well, they make this show run on time. So thanks to all of you who have joined our community already. If you like our content and want more, from special segments to interviews and merch, you can join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. I'm spending all of my iced coffee money on other people's shows because I think this is the time that we have to support our independent media.